Okay, that's fine. Yeah, so I'll get a prompt.
Welcome everyone to the Regional Forum on Integrated. Where do I go?
Are you connected, Mr. Shah? And can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah,
Dr.
we
Mishra,
can
you're
hear you.
audible.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So we'll just quickly introduce the session. Welcome everyone to the Regional Forum on Integrating Resilience and Adaptation into Infrastructure Investment, Learning and Opportunities for Future-Proofing Infrastructure of Developing Economies. I'd like to introduce Mr. Jagan Shah, who's the Regional Senior Fellow at IDFC Institute, and he's also the Senior Advisor Capacity Building at the World Bank. Over to you, Mr. Shah.
Thank you, Aishwarya. And a very good afternoon to everybody from across the world who's joined us now for the Regional Forum number 2 on integrating resilience and adaptation into infrastructure investment. As you're all fairly aware, I'm sure the developing world is in need for the investment of massive amounts of money for filling infrastructure gaps, as well as recovering from the impacts of the pandemic and other kinds of crises developed because of impacts of climate change. Infrastructure investments tend to be large in magnitude, as well as fairly risky because of the dedicated uses for which their infrastructure is built. Out of estimated $97 trillion of global infrastructure investments, about to be made by 2040, about 2/3 is yet to be made, and this is likely to be in the developing world. So de-risking infrastructure investments is a very high priority for all countries in the developing world. At COP26, the issue of decarbonization has taken a very important, a great salience and has become very important. And the risks associated with assets getting stranded because of changes in technology, transitions of various kinds, such as in energy, agriculture, commerce, as well as urbanization, have a cascading impact on the way in which we look at infrastructure investment worldwide, but more so in the developing world. To make infrastructure inclusive, to make it affordable, and to de-risk it from climate risk as well as other kinds of risks over the longer life cycle of investments is a very high priority task. This task can only be completed if we have sufficient data, if we are using evolved predictive models that help us to think about and anticipate risks to infrastructure and to plan for those investments. And in order to do this, developing economies will have to understand risk better. It'll have to develop new tools and methodologies for allocating risk and defining what is the most highest value for money that can be afforded. And this will pertain to the operations and maintenance of existing infrastructure assets and also define the way in which we design and build our new infrastructure. These are the kinds of background issues that will inform our session today. Overall, we are hoping that through this session, we'll be able to find some answers to questions regarding how developing economies can manage their risk, how successful practices and lessons from one geography can be applied to other geographies, and you will see a range of experience represented by our panel today, and how the sector itself can prepare better for the challenges of governance, the challenges of regulation, as well as the human resources required for the development of future-proofed climate investment and infrastructure. Who are the actors who are going to make a difference in this? what are the skills they require, what is the knowledge they require. These are the kinds of questions that we hope we will find answers to in this session. And I'm fairly confident that we will indeed find answers, because we have an excellent panel today, led by a keynote address by Dr. P.K. Mishra, who is Principal Secretary to the Honorable Prime Minister of India. We are joined as the first presenter by Dr. Alhamdu Dorsuma, who is the Acting Director for Climate Change at the African Development Bank. The second presentation today will be by Dr. Svenja Surminski, who is Managing Director, Climate and Sustainability at Marsh McLennan, and also member of the UK's Committee on Climate Change Adaptation. And our discussant today is going to be Mrs. Cynthia Asare Bediako, Chief Director, Ministry of Environment, Science, Technology and Innovation in the Government of Ghana. So with this excellent lineup of speakers and panelists and discussant today, let us commence our session. And I'd like to do that by first inviting and welcoming Dr. P.K. Mishra, who is the Principal Secretary to the Honorable Prime Minister of India. Dr. Mishra is a former member of the Indian Administrative Service. He has an extensive experience in the administrative service, occupying senior positions, and has also worked in field organizations as well as policy-making bodies and committees in the government. Dr. Mishra headed a task force of the Union Home Ministry during 2012-13 to review the Disaster Management Act of 2005. He was chairman of a committee constituted by the Union Agriculture Ministry in 2013 to review the working of crop insurance schemes in India. He was on the International Advisory Group of the World Bank to prepare a disaster recovery framework at the global level. When the National Disaster Management Authority was set up towards the end of 2005, Dr. Mishra played a crucial role in operationalizing its structure, its functions, and the perspective for the authority. So with those introductory words, I welcome Dr. P.K. Mishra.
Thank you, Mr. Jagan Shah. Mr. Jagan Shah, eminent speakers, and distinguished participants. A very good afternoon to all of you. I am pleased that the International Conference on Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, ICDRI, has become a global platform for discourse on mainstreaming disaster and climate resilience for infrastructure development. Today, the theme of this session, as Mr. Shah mentioned, integrating resilience and adaptation into infrastructure investment, is highly contextual to developing economies. As risk-informed infrastructure investment are essential for sustained and inclusive social and economic growth in these nations, the developing economies. Developing economies, whether in Asia, Africa, or Latin America, are focused on investment into infrastructure sector, and the value is huge. Developing economies are expected to represent around 60% to 70% of future infrastructure needs. The majority of infrastructure investment are required in transport and power sectors, two critical sectors that are also at the heart of decarbonization strategies. India, for example, has proposed to spend Indian rupee 10 lakh crore or US dollar 140 billion in the budget for 2022-23 and build a thriving economy. Indeed, since the COVID engulfed the entire world, the Government of India has focused not only on some small amount of stimulus, but mainly on infrastructure development, which will increase the rates of growth and employment. Amidst the complexity of the developing economies, the commitment for equitable development in all regions of the country is at the forefront. It is not only necessary to develop the country as a whole, but there should be equitable development in all the areas for inclusive approach to growth. The pandemic has made the world realize how an uncertainty can upend the society and the economy. It has also evidently shown countries their vulnerabilities to shocks and that hit our collective well-being. It has prompted countries to preempt risk, prepare for risk, and to the extent feasible, uncertainties also. As all of us know, the probability of risk can be estimated, but it is not feasible to estimate the likelihood of an uncertain event occurring. But still, we need to be prepared, as we saw during the pandemic, because it was not expected in the recent memories that a pandemic can cause such dislocation all over the world. Disasters have direct and indirect impact on human life, livelihoods, infrastructure, and financial systems. In many of the middle and low income economies, annual losses due to disasters account for significant share of the gross domestic product. Across globe, various forums and platforms are striving towards reducing the risks and integrating resilience to infrastructure and systems. I would like to emphasize the word integrating resilience to infrastructure and systems. Leaping, the countries are transitioning towards green policies and net zero emissions. Both the transition risk arising from policy transition and infrastructure exposure to risk from natural and man-made disasters are exposing the financial system to risk at an alarming rate. As we know, more the infrastructure we have, the exposure to risk of the financial system is more. And as we develop more and more, as we have seen in recent times, the loss of life has been reduced, but loss in terms of economic loss has increased. And this is bound to increase as we develop more infrastructure, and this can lead to more dislocation. The prevalence of increased exposure to risk needs to be managed to avoid depletion of assets and returns on investment. Several countries have already evinced their assets being stranded due to transition in policy. For example, if we go for a non-fossil based power, we might have some assets getting stranded, which were earlier coal-based. Two, damaged assets and failed investment due to poor data and monitoring methodologies on vulnerabilities, risks, and future shocks. As we know, catastrophes have strong intertemporal linkages with risk. In my understanding, apart from defining and planning investment for infrastructure creation, developing economies should also focus on integrating resilience and adaptation into both investment and infrastructure. As I see it, the following may provide a roadmap for de-risking investments and integrating resilience into infrastructure. First, building technical and institutional capacities on managing risk and disasters, evolving bolder policies and framework for private investment. Second, risk mitigation system with better data and strengthened risk assessment methodologies for improving the quality, consistency, and availability of data on hazards, exposures, vulnerabilities, and losses. Third, a sound mechanism of public-private cooperation to support coverage of disaster risk by risk-sharing models where government intervenes on risk mitigation measures, which are basically in the nature of public goods, and private sector supporting insurability of high-impact events. Fourth, promote public awareness on disaster risk and ways to secure financial protection on investment. And finally, enhanced coordination and cooperation on management. It is necessary to strengthen national, regional, and global coordination and delivery mechanisms targeting better financial assistance and improve the cost effectiveness of recovery assistance. The session has eminent domain experts to share their experiences and present their expertise in reducing disaster risk and integrating resilience in infrastructure investment, focusing on developing economies. I am sure the deliberations will help us further refine our policies and practices. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mishra, for a very inspiring keynote speech. I'd like to just remind the audience about some of the key points from Dr. Mishra's keynote. Dr. Mishra started by pointing out that after the pandemic, the government of India has been using stimulus investments as a way to also revive the economy. In this, the priority has been on equitable development, inclusive approaches, and this is important for the entire developing world as we bring about a just recovery and a green recovery from the pandemic. Dr. Mishra also highlighted that the vulnerability to shocks is something that we must keep in mind as we look at preempting and planning for risks and building those risks into our preparation of projects and investments. He highlighted that the annual losses due to disaster have a very significant impact on a country's GDP, and therefore it is of high priority that we pay attention to the needs of this particular aspect of planning for infrastructure. Dr. Mishra stressed that integrating resilience in the planning of infrastructure structures and systems is a very important priority, and integrating resilience will require us both to develop the assessment of risk as a more evolved assessment framework, but also to anticipate the kinds of impacts that policy transitions have on existing infrastructure assets which tend to get stranded, especially the examples of sectors like energy, where technology itself and decarbonization as a global priority are impacting existing assets. In the end, Dr. Mishra stressed on 5 key points, and I'd like to remind the audience about this because it sets the tone for our session. We need to build technical and institutional capacities. We need to have better data and methodologies. A sound public-private partnership understanding, and also the importance of the insurance sector is important. The 4th point was about looking at public finances and public awareness with regard to the way in which we are building assets. And last but not the least, the importance of coordination mechanisms so that different countries can coordinate efforts across boundaries and across their sovereign domains to help each other as well as build knowledge and capacities. These were extremely valuable keynote points. Thank you, Dr. Mishra, very much for delivering this address. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Shah. I'll be here for about half an hour, then of course I will go offline.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mishra, for staying with us. I'd like to now move on to invite and introduce our first presenter in this session. Dr. Hamdou Dorsuma is Acting Director of the Climate Change and Green Department at the African Development Bank. Dr. Dorsuma is also the Manager Climate and Green Growth within the African Development Bank. He's responsible for leading and managing the bank's team of climate change, green growth specialists, and climate finance officers in the headquarters and the regional hubs of the bank. Dr. Dorsuma also worked for 2 other international organizations, namely the Observatory of Sahara and Sahel in Tunis from 2005 to 2009 as the Environment and Climate Change Officer, and for the World Meteorological Organization in Geneva from 2012 to 2014 as the Senior Program Manager for Resource Mobilization and Development Partnerships. Dr. Dorsuma is a national from the country of Chad. He holds a doctorate of business administration and joint PhD degree between the Luxembourg Business Science Institute and the School of Management of the Jean Moulin University in Lyon in France. Over to you, Dr. Dorsuma, for your presentation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, for this introduction. Can somebody help me with the slides? I'm going to speak about the need for managing stranded asset risk as well as other climate risk in Africa and the role of the African Development Bank. Next slide. Let me start with a quick overview. As you all know, since the adoption of the Paris Agreement in 2015, the concept of stranded assets has attracted a lot of interest. It generally refers to the assets such as natural resources, minerals, and fossil fuels that become devalued or can no longer be monetized, according to the United Nations University. Overall, it is estimated that oil and gas assets, for instance, worth 1.3 trillion could be left stranded by 2050 if the fossil fuel industry does not adapt to greener climate policies. This is a conclusion from the International Energy Agency report. In Africa, 70% of exports are derived from the oil, gas, and mineral sectors. And this accounts for half of the continent's GDP. So the issue of a stranded asset is very critical for the African continent, which is currently at the crossroads, caught between 2 agendas. One, using its abundant natural resources to meet the needs of its growing populations and emerging economies. And number 2, meeting the objectives of the Paris Agreement, as well as the Sustainable Development Goals. It is in this context that managing stranded asset risk is key in Africa, in the context actually of poor performance of the extractive sector, in the continent. Next slide. There are both opportunities and challenges coming out of stranded assets. Opportunities include better resource planning, better governance and efficiency of the extractive sector, further developing the manufacturing sector, which is largely underdeveloped yet in the continent, investing in green infrastructure, and also developing regional markets across African countries. But there are challenges, which include: one, limited policy incentives to move away from the extractive industry, which is the main source of stranded assets in Africa. Number two, the lack of financing, technology, and capacity to drive the transition to a climate resilient and decarbonized future in Africa. And number three, limited awareness by policymakers on the risk of asset stranding in Africa. Next slide. If you look at the resources that are available in the continent, first, the risk of stranded assets is high in the non-renewable energy sector, non-renewable resources sector, actually, especially in the resource-rich countries and those countries which rely mostly on extractive industry. 90% of African countries depend on primary commodities, and 2/3 of them are dependent on minerals. So as latecomers to the fossil fuel industry, African countries are increasing currently oil production with the recent discoveries of oil and gas. Yet, asset stranding will have significant implications on both current and future economic growth in Africa. Therefore, Africa needs a long-term strategy on the future of stranded assets, including fossil fuels and minerals. But there are good examples, actually. For instance, in South Africa, the mining companies are already adopting energy-efficient technologies to reduce their carbon footprint. In Nigeria, the country has introduced innovative climate-friendly initiatives, such as the National Gas Flare Commercialization Initiative. Now, if you look at renewable resources, Africa has a lot of potential also in that area. But all of those resources, including forests, land, fisheries, and water, are also under threat because of rapid depletion or degradation of these resources. And this presents a serious sustainability risk. Renewable energy sector also offers opportunity to unlock Africa's social and economic development. But we need to move away from the current fossil fuel-based power systems to more renewable energy in the future. Next slide. Africa is also facing with several other climate risks. Actually, according to IPCC, Africa is already warming at a faster rate than the global average. The recent climate vulnerability index from Notre Dame University shows that 9 out of the 10 most vulnerable countries in the world are in Africa, are in sub-Saharan Africa. The most recent IPCC report shows that countries in West, Central, and East Africa are among the global hotspots of high human vulnerability. The particularity in Africa is that one of the biggest threats is the intersection between climate change and non-climatic drivers, which combine and exacerbate human vulnerability. Key climate risks in the continent include drought, flooding, and tropical cyclones, and this results in reduced crop productivity, food insecurity, and adverse effects on livestock. Other risks include health impacts with climate-sensitive diseases such as malaria and cholera, amplification of water stress, forced migration and human insecurity, significant biodiversity loss, pronounced adaptation deficit, and this results in changes in key economic sectors, resulting in loss and damage and decrease Africa's GDP, estimated at about 8.2 to 12.1%. Next slide. Now, in this context, what we are doing as the African Development Bank, we are prioritizing climate action as part of our development agenda in the continent, in line with our new climate change and green growth policy and strategy adopted last year. Over the recent years, we have significantly increased our climate finance from 9% of our investment in 2016 to 41% in 2021. Given Africa's high vulnerability to climate risk, we are placing a particular emphasis on adaptation. We have actually significantly increased our share of adaptation from 36% of climate finance in 2016 to 67% last year. So we have met the parity goal that we fixed for ourselves in 2018. In response to climate risk, we are currently championing several transformative and large-scale programs, such as the 25 billion Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program, a joint program with the Global Center on Adaptation, the 20 billion Desert to Power initiative, which is aiming to create the largest solar zone in the Sahel region in Africa, as well as other programs such as the Africa Disaster Risk Financing Initiative and the Africa Climate Smart Agriculture Program. Next slide. We are also supporting policy reforms to minimize the risk of stranded assets through country dialogues and through policy-based lending. The bank has established what we call the Africa NDC Hub since 2017 in order to support African countries to develop and implement their nationally determined contributions and also their long-term strategies on climate change. We are currently significantly mobilizing climate finance and also green finance, for instance, green bonds, while we are greening the existing brown sectors such as power, infrastructure, and industry sectors. We have set a specific goal to screen all our operations for climate risk and opportunities, and also provide support and advisory services to our client countries. Next slide. My last slide is just to conclude on the fact that Africa heavily relies on extractive industries, which have significant potential for asset stranding, including oil, gas, and minerals. The continent also accounts for a significant proportion of fossil fuels and minerals, which are yet to be harnessed. In this context, stranded assets in Africa raise a significant concern about the future economic development prospects of the continent. Without significant access to financing, technology, and capacity, Africa will not leapfrog into a decarbonized future and will continue to unsustainably harness its abundant natural capital. Moving forward, it is critical to mitigate the risk of stranded assets in Africa through investments, policy measures, awareness, and also reskilling the workers that are in the extractive sectors. Otherwise, the decarbonization of African economies will be significantly delayed. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Darsuma, for sharing with us the prospects, the opportunities, the challenges in the African continent, and the perspective on the efforts taken by the African Development Bank. In summary, I'd like to share with the audience some of the key points that I jotted down from this presentation. Dr. Darsuma started by reminding us that the idea of stranded assets was introduced in the Paris Agreement of 2015, where it was recognized that natural resources, minerals, and fossil fuels will be undergoing a transition and need to be addressed. One startling fact is that 70% of Africa's exports are from the extractive industries of oil, gas, and minerals, and this constitutes half of the continent's GDP. Laying that as the sort of the base of the argument, Dr. Darsuma then shared with us that there are opportunities in changing the ways in which manufacturing and mining industries are operating, as well as highlighted the challenges with regard to the capacities required for doing this and also the policy changes. So, for instance, he gave the example that while society can benefit from the renewable resources available in Africa, such as forests, the fisheries, and land resources, but these are all under threat because of the style of the patterns of development and the style of development. Mining companies are making efforts to reduce their energy consumption. However, all of this needs to be scaled up as well as accelerated. In terms of the impacts on human settlements and societies, there is a startling trend, which is that Africa is already a hot spot in terms of human vulnerability, and as a continent is heating faster than the global average in terms of the rise of temperatures. The African Development Bank has made many efforts. It has increased its investments in climate finance, or rather made available climate finance from 9% in 2016. It has increased it to 41% in 2021, which is a very significant commitment from the bank. The African Development Bank has also been supporting the development of the Africa NDC hub to help countries in Africa with their nationally determined contributions to mitigating climate change mitigation, and also introducing green bonds and other instruments to help countries in Africa deal with this massive challenge. Thank you, Dr. Dorsuma, for your presentation, and let us move on to our second presentation. Our presenter is Dr. Svenja Surminski. She's Managing Director, Climate and Sustainability at Marshall McLellan, and a member of the UK's Committee on Climate Change Adaptation Committee. She is also the chair of the Munich Climate Insurance Initiative. Dr. Surminski holds a research post at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment, which is part of the London School of Economics and Political Science. She oversees research projects on climate risk management, sustainable finance, climate and resilience strategies. She currently co-leads Insure Resilience's work on resilient infrastructure. And for the last 6 years, she was, for 6 years, she was associate principal at Vivid Economics at McKinsey, and has held several positions in the international insurance industry. A political scientist and ecological economist by training, Dr. Surminski has worked across environment, social and economic perspectives with a focus on urban communities and the private sector. She's a contributing author to the IPCC, lead author of the UK's Climate Change Risk Assessment, and research lead for the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance. Dr. Surminski, we welcome you to our presentation. Thank you.
Well, many thanks for the invite, and it's great to be here and to hear and see from so many experts from across the world. I'm giving this talk today from a research perspective based on my work at the LSE and also with the UK's Adaptation Committee. But as you've just kindly introduced me, so since last week, I have a new function in the private sector at the global risk management firm Marsh McLennan. And I will say a few words on this at the end, because I think there is a big focus also on the role of insurance and the private sector that we can capture here. Dr. Dorsuma spoke about the important issue of stranded assets. And well, there is a real risk of having stranded infrastructure assets because of not managing the physical risk, climate change, adequately. And that's basically my entry point. And that's where I want to share some thoughts on this, based on research, engagement with governments, insurers, and development organizations. If we can move to the next slide, please. Well, infrastructure is essential for all of us. Development is not possible without. But it faces many challenges, and one of it is a changing climate. Not that long ago, climate science was not really part of the picture, and managing disaster risk was often neglected. I think that has changed, at least to some extent, because we have much better knowledge and understanding, have tools and data, although there are a lot of challenges, particularly with regards to many of the sort of developing countries where actually data is still an issue. But I think by and large, the understanding of risk has changed, and what this interplay that actually builds risk, this kind of interplay between hazard, exposure, and vulnerability, I think we have learned a lot and we understand it much better. The question is, what do we do with that knowledge? And do we actually then use that when we make decisions about investment, about policy, And well, I think the answer is we don't do enough of it. So that's kind of what's driving my work, is the quest to change that. If we can move to the next slide. It is quite easy to say, look, I mean, we need to be better prepared. We need to focus more on, smart risk management, and we need to have good strategies. And I think a lot of people turn to the insurance sector and say, look, here's an example, and they've led the way, for example, when it comes to fire risk or some other aspects. So what is it that we need to do to actually embrace climate risk better, and then not only embrace it, understand it, but also manage it better? Well, the reality, unfortunately, and many of you will know this far better than me, is that we still, despite all the knowledge and understanding and evidence and tools, we still tend to be inherently reactive. And a lot of action only gets going if something bad has happened, if we need to build something again, if we have a drastic shock, if we have an event. And I've sort of put some figures there that sort of shows this imbalance when you look at global funds. I mean, that figure is a little bit dated now, but I don't actually think it has shifted significantly. So there is this question of, what we can do to become better prepared and to actually invest in climate adaptation and resilience, so that we kind of get out of this need to actually repair, rebuild, and also deal with huge human consequences of climate impacts. So this is not sustainable. And what needs to happen is to steer financial flows towards activities where actually climate resilient and also, low emissions development is possible. So, that's common knowledge, and a lot of efforts are being made. But what does that mean in practice? And I'll just want to give you a few pointers. So if we can move to the next slide. I understand, obviously, the focus of this event here is global, but infrastructure challenges are everywhere, and different resilient efforts are required according to the hazard types. And I just wanted to share with you this example from the UK, where under the Climate Change Act, a regular national risk assessment has to be conducted. And I had the privilege of being involved in the previous two's risk assessment, and a strong focus there, or one of the key risks identified, is around infrastructure. Well, obviously, this also relates, to those who own, who use, who regulate, who rely on infrastructure, and the disruption that can occur if infrastructure doesn't work as needed. But I think at this point, it's important to say, look, we see there's this global need for infrastructure investment. And it was mentioned earlier, I mean, the figures are significant. So what does it take to actually recognize, that these investments are at risk, from physical risk, transition risk, and I also dare say liability risk arising from climate, and capturing that at point of making the investment decisions, and actually using it to catalyze and generate more investment in infrastructure. Next slide. Again, it is important to say, look, we need to understand, assess, identify these risks. But then the key point is, taking that information and making decisions with it. And that is not widespread. And, it's where I think the science community can also help. And, exercises such as this one that we see in the UK are useful, but they're only as useful as what's then being done. And is this used by infrastructure providers? Is this used by those who make investment decisions? And often the answer is no. And I think that's where we need to focus on. Next slide. So resilient as an investment is an important understanding. And a couple of years ago, I worked with colleagues from the World Bank and from ODI on this new tool. We call it the triple resilient dividend. And the aim was really to change the narrative around resilience and to identify and quantify co-benefits to show that actually resilience pays. Next slide, please. And what we were sort of stipulating is a framework that allows you to capture the various benefits that resilience can bring, and to strengthen that business case or the economic case for resilience. And I think this is now, this is an important sort of narrative, but it's also a practical tool, and it's being applied across the world. And I think it is starting to be used also in the infrastructure sector, because it strengthens that argument that far too often people also see resilience still as a cost. And here we're providing a lot of reasons why it actually should be seen as an investment. Next slide, please. So I wanted to conclude by a few words around insurance. And as was kindly mentioned in the introduction, I'm currently working with the Insure Resilience Global Partnership in their quest to actually come up with more integrated, holistic solutions. Because I think, fortunately, long gone are those days when, insurance has been seen as, the silo solution or the silver bullet. And instead, I think what we're moving towards is really understanding how different instruments can be combined and how together they can support resilience, and how actually also insurance can incentivize more investments, can help to de-risk investments and improve standards, inform, and ultimately also provide protection. So that's really at the center of this. If we move to the next slide. So Insure Resilience has created a forum for different entities, including some insurers, including some development agencies, and CDRI is also heavily engaged in this. And the idea is really to have a fruitful engagement and to look at the whole value chain around infrastructure and to say, okay, where are these risks and where do we have knowledge? Where does it sit? How can we use insurance as a way to facilitate that engagement and then to create better outcomes? And, you just see a fairly simplified description of that value chain. That process is still ongoing, and further participation is really encouraged. So please reach out if this is of interest. And I know colleagues at the Insure Resilience Secretariat would be also very happy to engage further. And the final words, next slide, please. So as of last week, I've moved and taken up a role in the private sector with Marsh McLennan, which is a global risk advisory and insurance broking firm. And the interesting thing is there is a significant amount of expertise also around infrastructure. There's significant knowledge around the different types of risk and potential insurance solutions. And I think what is really also needed is efforts such as the Insure Resilience Forum to connect that and to bring that to those who are actually facing difficult decisions, and to work, find solutions to climate risk and ultimately to move us to a more resilient world. So with that, I want to conclude and thank you very much for inviting, and I'm looking forward to our discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Surminski, for actually building on the previous presentation and highlighting the importance of assessing risk and addressing the various possibilities with regard to response from the market. Dr. Surminski started by highlighting an issue which I think bears repetition in all presentations, which is that we do have a paucity of data, and without data and without the kind of methodologies that are required, Dr. Mishra had also pointed this out, we are not going to be able to assess the risks to infrastructure globally. And however, there are also I guess, attitudinal challenges here. As Dr. Surminski pointed out, we are recognizing that there is an interplay between hazards and vulnerabilities. However, we are not paying enough attention to understanding those, the interplays between the two. I think I'd certainly like to remind the audience about a quotation that Dr. Surminsky had on one of her slides, which I think is marvelous in capturing the essence of the argument. And this is from the Lloyds of London from 2017. We have to create a world in which it is unacceptable not to have planned in advance. And I guess this is one of the key messages we should take away from the session. We tend to be reactive in our attitude towards hazards and dealing with vulnerabilities. However, we need to actually have better response in terms of planning. And to put some statistics to that, globally, 12% of funds are going into risk reduction and preventive actions, and 88%, a staggering 88%, actually goes into reconstruction efforts. And clearly, there is a need almost to flip that over if possible. This is not sustainable, as Dr. Surminsky reminded us. She also asked us to understand that there are three different types of risks: physical risks, transition risks, as well as liability risks, which need to be highlighted. She has worked in the past on a very important initiative with the World Bank on defining the triple dividend of resilience and helping countries recognize that resilience is actually something that can be written into the preparation of projects and thereby to anticipate and plan for future risks. During her work with Insure Resilience Global Partnership, Dr. Surminsky has been focusing more and more on bringing the discourses on risk finance and on insurance closer together. And overall, in terms of the impact this might have in public trust as well as government's ability to deal with risks. Thank you, Dr. Surminsky, for highlighting these points for us. To move on, we'd like to invite our discussant for today, after which we will have a number of different interactions between the panelists. Our discussant is Mrs. Cynthia Asare Bediako, who is currently working as a Chief Director of the Ministry of Environment, Science, Technology and Innovation in the government of Ghana. She has been in this position since March of 2020. Before joining this ministry, Mrs. Cynthia has worked as a Chief Director at the Office of the Vice President of the Government of Ghana. Prior to her posting to the Office of the Vice President, she was the Chief Director at the Office of the Head of Civil Service, having been appointed in July 2014. She's a career civil servant in the administrative class with over 30 years of administrative experience and has served in various ministries. She holds a master's degree in alternative dispute resolution from the University of Ghana, Legon, and another master's degree in public policy and administration from the Institute of Social Studies at The Hague. She has a BA in social sciences from the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology. Mrs. Bediako, welcome to our session, and as the discussant, please share your thoughts.
Thank you very much, moderator, speakers, colleague panelists, participants. I bring you warm greetings from Accra, the capital of Ghana. It's 10:15 a.m. here in Ghana. And so I would say good morning to you all. This morning's conversation, as we have started, and I am excited to be part of it. First, I'm very happy with the keynote speaker who has set the tone for our conversation, especially looking at the key points that he left with us, that we have to build technology, better data collection, public and private sector participation, public awareness, and coordination if we are dealing with this issue of stranded assets. I'm also very delighted with the presentation made by Dr. Dosumu in the area of stranded assets and giving us a very whole scenario as it exists in Africa and other places. And I also support very much what has been said by our last speaker. Now, in focusing my conversation or discussion this morning, I want us to have in mind, at the back of our minds, that this issue of stranded assets has come about as a result of climate change and is part of the nexus. for us in Africa and managing stranded assets, we have to also have at the back of our mind that one, Africa is described as a very youthful country or continent, and we have a whole lot of youth with unemployment situations on our hands. Therefore, every government has to create jobs. There's the need for massive poverty reduction and infrastructure improvement. In doing all these, job creation, poverty reduction, infrastructure development, there is the need for huge capital and investment. Every country depends on its investment and capital from its assets, both natural and man-made. And it is therefore very critical in discussing stranded assets in the nexus of climate change, in looking at Africa and how we could address these things. A lot of the data has been provided by earlier speakers in terms of what it is that Africa either stands to gain or to lose in this nexus. But distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, let me put it here that Ghana, just like all nations, especially the developing nation or countries, is vulnerable to the raging effects of climate change and therefore stranded assets. These negative impacts of climate change are intensifying daily and are likely to worsen in the very near future with highly unbearable consequences to achieving the better future that we are all looking for. But these negative impacts of climate change could only erode the economic and social gains that developing countries in many African countries are looking for if they are not addressed here and now. The critical sectors which we've already made allusion to, such as agriculture, energy, and the extraction industries, are the basis or the backbone to many African economies. However, with climate change and having bought into the nexus requires that these assets are either managed in a different way or are not touched at all. The impact of climate change on these critical sectors of developing economies or countries, that is the agriculture, energy, forestry, water, and transport, are very critical and form the reasons why many African countries are very much interested in these discussions on stranded assets. The urgent need to bring meaning to our economic prosperity and better the life of our citizenry is pivotal to the awakening conscience of developing economies in the face of this dramatic change. These developments, as we've already known, has brought about this context of us discussing today climate change and stranded assets. Dr. Desomo has made, as I've said already, some allusion to the figures and the statistics. But let me emphasize that the Paris Agreement on Climate Change integrated assessment models estimated that Africa must forego about 90% of known reserves of coals, 34% of gas, and 26% of oil. An indication that developing countries such as Ghana must reduce our dependency on extractive industry in order to meet the global target of emission, that is the 1.5 degrees. If I should explain, what are we saying here? As I've already indicated, in many of our developing economies, we have the teaming used to provide jobs for. We have many mouths to feed due to overgrazing, poor soil nutrients, as well as either over flooding and a lot of factors that climate tends to put on our various economies. To do this, we would have to depend on our natural resources to either make the capital that we need to build our infrastructure or to sell to make the necessary incomes that nations require to develop. Unfortunately, with the new policies and the new strategies in reducing the effect of climate change, many of us, and we all do agree, however, that we buy into the 1.5 reduction as agreed at COP26. How do we, as a developing country, mainly developing or thriving on natural resources, combine these two impacts to make the necessary gains or address the needs of our youth and the entire citizenry? Ghana, for instance, since 2017, the government has launched what we call the free senior high school education, with the view to providing education for all, and by that enhancing the human capacity and capital. A lot of this has been funded from the management of our oil gains, which means that with the new policies, there's likely that Ghana will have to relook at other sources of managing or funding its free senior high school education. Again, another agenda is the one district, one factory that the government has rolled out. This requires that we enhance or add value to our extractive industries. Unfortunately, or somehow, we would need to rethink and relook at these interventions. Whilst we are looking at all this in the bigger picture of Ghana Beyond 8, we also have signed on and agreed that there's the need for us to reduce carbon emissions. It is for this reason that in Ghana, in developing its nationally determined contributions, the ministry, together with other sectors, carefully considered Ghana's current move to the policy of formalizing the economy, the vigorous pursuit of industrialization, leapfrogging free education policy, and massive investment in the energy sector, etc., before arriving at a set of policies, actions, and programs that Ghana submitted. What we mean here is that whilst Ghana has a lot of natural resources and are likely to be faced with the issue of stranded assets, we also agree that there is the need for us to tread cautiously, considering the bigger picture of climate change. And for that matter, in designing the nationally determined contributions, Ghana took its time to relook at all the issues that were before us, especially in the area of energy, transport, and industry, to ensure that our policies and programs took into consideration the need for us to manage the risk that are associated with the possible moving away from depending on our oil and natural resources. Again, Ghana recently launched a report on the infrastructure resilience, which it has, together with the University of Oxford, through the Global Energy Environment Fund, the UNEPA, and United Nations Office for Projects, put together to assess the critical areas of Ghana's infrastructure and how they are susceptible or adaptable to the impact of climate. These studies were carried out, as I've alluded to earlier, in the area of transport, energy. And the findings are that there is the need for Ghana to critically look at this infrastructure in such a way that going forward, we will be able to manage these critical sectors to avoid the impact of climate change. The study is available, and I'll share it at the right time for us to all have a look at it. All these efforts that Ghana is making is aiming at ensuring that the nexus of stranded assets, as we've all agreed to, does not come to us as a shock, but something that we really need to plan to. And I think Dr. Semenke has made us allusion to this in a form of insurance. How do we plan to ensure that our assets that are likely to be affected by climate change and the global policies are managed? We also intend to develop national strategies on stranded assets and an economic diversification plan to inform the country's long-term climate transitions, as well as initiate processes to push the agenda item on a possible national stranded assets in the subsidiary body or implementation meetings in 2022 as we move on. Ghana intends to forge partnership with like-minded countries to speak with one voice to canvass the ways to safeguard the just use of the natural resources to support development. And for this reason, Ghana will continue to appeal to the financial and development institutions. And I'm happy to say that the Africa Development Bank was part of the team that supported the UNOPS and Oxford University study on the resilient infrastructure in Ghana. And we are hoping that more such hands will come on board and especially move the study to the next phase by implementing the projects that have been identified in these things. In conclusion, what I would want to add to our conversation this morning is the fact that, yes, stranded assets are likely to happen or are things that are on the table for discussion. The African countries are likely to face a lot of challenges, as Dr. Dumusu has said, that either there will be a delay because that is where a lot of our capital and our resources for development are hinged. However, we also know that climate change has no boundaries, and therefore there's the need for all of us to think through this together. We therefore call on like-minded nations and through this forum that we all come together to forge policies that are adaptable and build capacities and provide the necessary funding so that this new discourse of stranded assets will gain root and help our nations in meeting the challenges of climate change whilst working to achieve the 1.5 degrees Celsius that we've all agreed to at COP26. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to more such contributions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bediako, for adding one more dimension to the overall discussion today, which is to highlight that there is unemployment as well as poverty in countries in Africa, and Ghana is no exception, and that there is a priority for national governments to create jobs and to deal with the risks that come from stranded assets and other kinds of risks which affect livelihoods and the standard of living of our populations. With that, I'm going to try and move our discussion forward very quickly. I'll request each of the presenters to share thoughts on specific questions, which I will pose. And please do take not more than about 2 to 3 minutes to respond to these questions. And if either of you would like to come in with a contribution in that respect, do let us know. I'd like to start with Dr. Surminsky. If I could just ask you to reflect a little bit in terms of some examples by which we can understand how national governments actually are building the institutional infrastructure as well as an understanding of how to use insurance and guarantees and other instruments to secure their infrastructure investments for the future. Could you share a few examples with us? Dr. Surminsky?
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. Yeah, I mean, you know, there are different approaches to this. And I think for some time there has been this idea of also to have chief resilience officers installed within government. I know that quite a few are doing this, and particularly also cities have sort of adopted that, so that you have a central function of someone who works across government, across different departments, across those responsible for infrastructure, across those who make the finance decisions, and has that overview, and can then sort of bring in knowledge, information at an early stage, but then also start building what we call risk management plans, including risk finance. And I think this is the important point. And I think I mentioned that earlier, this idea of integrated solutions. And a few countries, I mean, we've been discussing this, for example, in the Philippines. There are really interesting governance approaches to this, and to risk management and disaster finance. And I think that the key is then to connect this also from national to local, and bring in then the infrastructure side. And I think often the question of ownership is important. So this idea of having someone who's then actually in charge of resilience within a government is actually quite interesting.
Thank you, Dr. Surminski, for a very crisp answer to the question. I'd like to pose a question to Dr. Darsuma. Dr. Darsuma, could you share with us some illustrative examples of the ways in which national governments are actually thinking about this very complex field of decision-making? Examples where decision-making is now getting informed by considerations with regard to risk assessment, as well as planning for reducing the impacts of possible climate events and hazards on local populations, industries, and communities. Could you share with us some examples of decision-making itself reflecting a change of attitude?
Thank you for the question. Actually, there are several examples of countries in Africa where governments are already taking decisions and actually actions to address the adverse impacts of climate change. Let me maybe start with one country like Nigeria, which has introduced, as I said in my presentation, some innovative instruments. They have a climate bill that has been endorsed by the parliament and then by the president of the country. I know that even at the level of the Central Bank of Nigeria has adopted some sustainability principles, and they have requested us to help and provide some advisory services on how these principles could be cascaded down to the level of commercial banks, etc. So there is a high-level decision-making by the legislator, by the government, but also what is interesting is that it is being cascaded down to the level of other entities like the central bank and at the level of commercial banks. And these will also ultimately come back to the small, medium enterprises, etc. So it's promising to see this approach really working at the level of government. Other countries, most of them actually are now developing their national adaptation plans. And these plans really, if well done, will help the countries to deliver on their commitment on adaptation. And as I said earlier, adaptation is Africa's priority. And countries need to come out with strong plans to address these issues. Because otherwise, we see what is happening on economies every year. We see extreme events happening, either drought or flooding or tropical cyclones. And these come with significant losses and damages in economies. And in the past, what we have seen is that there was this position of countries asking for international support because they are not responsible for the climate change, the global warming, yet they are the one bearing the brunt of it. So now we see some shift from the governments that they have also to play their role, using even domestic resources to address it. But we know that domestic resources are not enough. If you look at the nationally determined contributions that African countries have submitted under the Paris Agreement, most of them, actually 80% of them, are conditional to external support. But they are already providing their own with the 20%. But yet this international support is also not coming. And this includes the $100 billion US dollars commitment by the international community to help developing countries address climate change. So I think governments are doing their part, but given the collective action needed to address climate change, the international community needs also to step in actions in order to support the efforts that governments are already making, using their limited domestic resources to address an issue that is global and which is significantly affecting their economies. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dorsuma, for reinforcing that point about the fact that countries need to cooperate and support each other to actually address the challenges rather than this sort of finger pointing that might happen with regard to addressing climate change impacts. I'd like to address one question to Ms. Bediako, if I may. Ms. Bediako, you have highlighted the importance of the youth and poverty reduction measures with regard to a country like Ghana. May I ask you to just reflect a little bit on the impact that this kind of prioritization would have with regard to skilling, with regard to human resource development, certifications, regulations, and so on, that need to be put in place so that, in a sense, an environment is created for more green jobs, more environment-oriented livelihoods in countries in the developing world, and what might be Ghana's own experience in this matter?
Thank you for the question. As I might have alluded to earlier, there's the need for government to provide jobs for the teeming youth. We depend on our natural resources to do most of these things. We also agree that we cannot do business as usual. And so what Ghana has been doing now, and together with our developing partners, has been to relook at our policies. At the moment, there is a plan for what we call the Stranded Energy Transition Plan.
Do we have a break in the signal?
Where the oil which we depend on to provide the free education and other things to the. So we are re-looking at our policies. Again, in determining our nationally determined contributions, NDCs have factored in the need of these stranded assets. And therefore, as I've indicated, we are not going in the direction that will just cause us to be dependent so much just only on our natural resources. There are a lot of support in adding value to our resources so that there's less, if for instance, we were using, for the sake of argument, 100 bags of cocoa, we should be able to use that same 100 bags, but due to value added to that quantum of cocoa that we produce, we have higher value and higher yields. So there's this policy of adding value to our natural resources instead of exporting raw resources, so that the incomes from our natural resources are higher, and therefore give governments the leeway to be able to do more. Because as I said, there's infrastructure gap. We can only do this infrastructure depending on our natural resources. These natural resources, the way we handle them, we cannot go about it in that same way. And therefore we need to, if we are mining the same 1 square kilometer, we should be able to get more from that than what we used to do. So that if we are farming 10 hectares, you'll be able to do 5 hectares, but get a better yield. And out of that, be able to provide jobs for the teeming youth and get more resources to do other things. So we are looking at adding value. That is one of the major parts of our things. And massive education. As I've said, the free senior high school is to ensure that every Ghanaian has a minimum of senior high school level of education. And it is believed that with that human capital, there's better management of the resources, understanding and appreciation. And therefore, whilst we harness about the same resource, we get higher yield and better input from that. So our policies are towards adding value to our natural resources, providing it free or wider education by building on our human capital, supporting youth to come out with a lot of innovation in turning around our resources so that, that there's more coming in from the same or little that we use on. So our policies are youth-friendly, supporting the youth with some capital. The National Youth Employment Agency is also providing some basic capital to the youth to make sure that they are part of the decision-making and the part of the change. And reliance on the natural resources becomes less. So these are some of the things that we are doing in that direction. And I'm hoping that it will provide us some support in managing assets or shifting focus to gain more.
Thank you, Ms. Bediako. I want to just take a few seconds to check with the other panelists. Would you have any inputs that you'd like to share with us on what your co-panelists have said? Dr. Dorsuma, Dr. Surminsky, anything to add? Otherwise, I'll address one more question. Okay.
I want to
yes,
just add that the work at country level needs to really be strengthened. So glad that Ghana is doing a lot also at the level of the government to address the issues of stranded assets and all the climate risk, but it's not enough. So really, we need to strengthen that effort at every country level in order to make sure that we don't miss an opportunity here of shifting from the unsustainable way of developing economies to more sustainable development in line with the priorities of the countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dorsuma, for reinforcing that point. I want to very quickly request each of you to respond to one question and my last question, and then we will look to the audience for Q&A if there are any questions. And this is regarding a organization like CDRI, which is hosting this conference. What kind of a role CDRI and other associated organizations might actually have in supporting the kind of integration that Dr. Surminsky highlighted. We need countries need to put together risk management plans, national adaptation plans. They need to address livelihood issues, as Ms. Bediako has highlighted. These are complex planning tasks. And can an organization like CDRI actually support countries in undertaking these kinds of challenges? Could each one of you perhaps just spare a minute to share your thoughts on this? And let me start by inviting Dr. Dorsuma.
Thank you. I really think an organization like ICRI could play an important role at various levels. Let me mention first awareness. I mentioned earlier that the awareness around the risk of stranded assets is not yet there, especially in regions like Africa, where we see still business as usual. So working on raising awareness on those issues is critical, and I believe this is an area where ICRI can play an important role. Also capacity, especially building technical capacity. The issue of technology transfer, especially in the context of South-South cooperation, for instance, there is a huge opportunities to transfer knowledge and technologies among countries and regions in the South, only in the South, and also even between the South and the North. There are a lot of opportunities. And lastly, advisory. I think the organization can play an important role in advising governments on best practices and also on how they can transform their economies towards more sustainable, industry sectors and towards more resilient infrastructure, for instance. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dorsuma. May I request Ms. Bediako to share her thoughts on this question? How can CDRI help countries?
Exactly. I think for even at this forum, there's quite a lot that has been poured out there, especially coming from the keynote speaker, where he made at least 5 key points. And I think Dr. Dosumo has also emphasized on some of them, that to us in some of these developing countries, the issue of stranded assets is a new discourse. And for that matter, there's the need for capacity building for us to understand and appreciate what it is that stranded assets means and its implication. Much as we agree that whilst even though Africa is said to be becoming hotter faster than before, our contribution to the climate change has been lower than other countries. Yet, because there are no boundaries to climate change and its effects, there's the need for all of us to jump in together. The private public partnership role is very important because we are talking about very capital intensive issues here and some things that governments alone may not be able to provide. And therefore, there's the need for this understanding and input from the private sector. As for awareness creation, it has already been said. Knowledge sharing and coordination, which was also mentioned by the keynote speaker, and I want to go by that it's very, very critical and important. For instance, reports on the resilient infrastructure, which the study from the Oxford University has published. I think it's something that we should be also able to share with other countries for the models and how it is used so that there's no need for reinventing the wheel. And therefore, if there are other similar such knowledge elsewhere, especially in the area of risk assessment and insurance, it's also important that we get it. And so going by the saying that countries cannot exist without planning, planning includes risk taking and insurance. And so we need to have more such dialogue. And so CDR can help by opening the dialogue in these areas so that more is known in the gray areas when it comes to stranded assets. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Bediako. Thanks very much. And lastly, can I come to Dr. Surminsky? Could you just share in about a minute and a half your thoughts on this question?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think there is a huge need to share best practice. I mean, best practice always sounds very, normative, but to give examples of, how things are being done and where it works. And, I'm always amazed, regardless whether it's a development agency, a government, or the private sector, the questions are the same. People really want to understand, what's working and how has it been done elsewhere. And I sometimes think, I guess this is an area where CDRI can play a really important role. And we have had good engagements so far. But I think we need to be careful that we do not get stuck in sort of what I call admiring the problem. And, that's important and understanding the problem. But, what we really need is then to also share stories where it actually works. Because, as we've heard also from the other two speakers with different examples from countries, there's a lot of progress being made. And I think that's really important to then also see, okay, well, this is where we are heading. So I think that's an important role that CDRI can play.
Thank you, Dr. Surminsky. I think you gave us a wonderful phrase there, that CDRI and organizations that are working in the space should actually contribute to finding solutions, helping countries understand best practices and not indulge in admiring the problem itself. Very nice phrase there. A very quick summation of some of the key points that have come out of our last section of the session. Clearly, CDRI can play a big role in terms of creating awareness, building capacities, even advisory support, as well as supporting countries with the technology transfer that is required. Capacity building for understanding new ideas such as stranded assets is very crucial. Knowledge sharing on subjects like this risk and resilience assessments, which are currently being done by CDRI. These can contribute greatly to national discourses. And most importantly, just to repeat the main point, we must focus attention on what has worked in different countries and what can be shared across from one country to another. And CDRI has a big role to play in this regard. I'd like to thank very much all of our speakers. And with that, I'd like to close the session. Thank you very much. Thank you to the audience. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.